Shall we start? Arrancamos. Muy buenas tardes, muy bienvenidos. Mi nombre es Juan José Cruces y soy el rector de la Universidad Torcuato Ditela. Dado que esta conferencia será en inglés, por respeto a nuestro invitado, voy a seguir en dicho idioma. It is a great honor to open this Ditela International Conversation Series with this talk by Professor Dani Rodrik from Harvard University. This talk, dedicated to our community by the generosity of Professor Rodrik and organized by our provost, Professor Juan Gabriel Tocatlian, is a great example of two guiding principles that we have followed since the outburst of the pandemic. First, we live in a world of incomplete contracts, and it is written nowhere how we should behave towards our community of students, faculty, and staff in the face of such an adverse shock. Since the beginning of the health crisis, we have committed all of our resources, energy, and flexibility to deliver the same education that we had originally promised, within the obvious limits of confinement, of course, but in the same time frame as had originally been set. If at all possible, we want to deliver even more, and this talk exemplifies that. The second one is that our institutional reaction to an immense adverse shock is a great part of the education that we pass on to our students. Even in the midst of crisis, new opportunities arise that allow us to seize new benefits. We would not even have dreamt of hosting Professor Rodrik for a remote talk just 6 months ago. So without further ado, let me turn this over to the Dean of our School of Government, Professor Eduardo Levy Yeyati, who will moderate this session. Eduardo and Professor Rodrik, may you please turn on your cameras and microphones.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Juan Jose. It is a pleasure for me and an honor to chair this first webinar with a distinguished colleague such as Dani Rodrik. Dani is currently the fourth foundation professor of international political economy at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. He is currently president-elect of the International Economic Association and co-director of Economics for Inclusive Prosperity, a site that I recommend you to browse over. His newest book is from 2017, Straight Talk on Trade, Ideas for a Sane World Economy. More to our point, I think Dani has been researching, debating for decades on areas that are becoming increasingly topical, such as globalization and trade or economic development, always with a policy orientation and with the view of creating a more inclusive world. In my opinion, Dani is the best type of critical thinker, one that thinks out of the box, constructively, and that helps to improve the real life impact of our dismal science, as of social sciences in general. He's the ideal person with which to start imagining the post-pandemic future of globalization, which is a topic that is at the center of the current talk, and the future of the global economy in general. Of course, Dani, you can talk of whatever you want, but that's sort of the main idea. The plan is for this session, for you, Dani, to present your ideas in the following half an hour, 30 minutes or so, and then in the next half an hour, we will be talking, including questions that we will be collecting from the audience. To the audience, you can make these questions in either English or Spanish. We will be translating them for Professor Rodrik to answer. Without further ado, Dani, welcome. This virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you, Eduardo. It's nice to make this connection virtually. As Professor Cruces noted, what silver lining of the strange world in which we find ourselves in is that now we're doing more of these online workshops and talks and gatherings. So thank you for the invitation to Professor Tokatlian originally. Thank you again, Professor Cruces. Thank you, Eduardo, for moderating this. I'm going to talk perhaps for about half an hour, as Eduardo mentioned, about how I see the world economy after the pandemic, and then we can discuss. I think it's easy to predict that the world is not going to look the same after this pandemic. COVID-19 presents us with huge challenges, a very deep crisis at this point. But I think if we take a medium-term look at what's been going on, I think we can reach the conclusion that what COVID-19 really does is mainly exacerbate ongoing problems and deepen existing tensions in our individual economies and in the global economy. And I say this because I think that our prevailing models of globalization, that is the model beyond our borders, as well as our models of development within our borders, those were unsustainable to begin with. I think, to caricature somewhat, we have a model of globalization, which I've called hyperglobalization, and I think the reasons for why I'm giving it a specific name will become clearer in my presentation. But that model has run out of steam. And I think our the basic model of development that has guided policymaking in middle-income countries, such as Argentina, as well as in low and rich countries, also have run into limits. And I think that was certainly for countries in the low and middle income range, that was a model essentially of what one might call growth through integration in the global economy. And that's unlikely to be paying off. So I believe a change in course is inevitable. And I think what we need to do is consider alternatives instead of trying to return to broken or unsustainable models. Just to telegraph what my main conclusions are going to be, I think in globalization, what that means is a return to the spirit of an earlier model of globalization, the Bretton Woods model of globalization, which was much less ambitious in its scope, even though it actually was quite successful in terms of stimulating both the development of global markets as well as domestic markets. I'll expand a little bit on what I mean by that. Secondly, with respect to our development models, I think we need to resign to a world where I think it's going to be much harder to attain the kinds of growth rates that we had in the last 2 decades or so in many developing countries. And then we'll need to develop a kind of a different model that emphasizes much more the development of middle-class jobs, the development of the domestic market, with a much greater focus on inclusion and equity, particularly with respect to the middle class. And again, that's something that I'm going to be opening up a little bit more in my talk. To start with the world economy, we know that COVID is hitting world trade very in a major way. The WTO estimates that the world volume of trade has already fallen by about 20% in the first 2 quarters of this year. The decline for the year as a whole might be around 15 to 20%. But if we look at the trend of world trade, we were already way off trend since 2007 to 2008, since the global financial crisis. the buoyancy of world trade has already declined significantly, with the elasticity of world trade with respect to world GDP fallen just slightly before 1, which is to say that the world trade was no longer expanding as rapidly, if not more rapidly, than world income. So this is already something that had been happening. One of the very important factors behind that decline in the buoyancy of world trade is actually somewhat quite dramatic reductions in the export orientation of some of the major middle income export successes of the last 30 years or so. Of course, chief among them, China. In China, the export to GDP ratio has already fallen by something like 15, 16 percentage points of GDP since the great financial crisis. This is really a remarkable decline in the export to GDP ratio of the country that essentially was behind, it was an engine behind the expansion of world trade in the last 30 years or so, as well as of course, the rise in global commodity prices, which benefited a lot of resource exporting countries in Latin America, including Argentina. This fall in the export to GDP ratio is most dramatic in China, but to some extent you can also see it in India as well, another major beneficiary of the last 20, 30 years of global expansion. There, the decline in export to GDP ratio is smaller than that in China, of the order of 5 percentage points or so, but is still quite noticeable. Global value chains have slowed down their expansion. That's another quantitatively measurable aspect of the slowing down of the world economy. And increasingly, I think what we've seen with respect to global supply chains has been a process of regionalization around 3 poles, the United States, Europe, and China. And I think it's a fair bet that given the concerns that have been expressed about sort of the securing supply chains, particularly medical supply chains, in a post-COVID world, that process of regionalization is likely to intensify. Those are quantitative indicators of a process of globalization that had already begun to slow down before COVID and even before Trump. So these reflect deeper tensions in the world economy, deeper tensions of the kind of model of globalization that we've had. And I want to mention 3 of those internal tensions of the kind of globalization we've had in the last few decades. One, the more narrowly economic tension is that the economics of global integration always rests on this trade-off that expansion of world trade and world finance is good to the extent that you get the gains from trade and the gains from specialization. But we know from growth economics and development economics and long history of long span of economic history that there is a contending force that is important, which is the gains from productive diversification of economies. That goes often in a somewhat reverse direction than specialization according to comparative advantage. If you want to attach personal names to this tension, you can say it's a tension between Adam Smith and Friedrich List, or alternatively a more sort of evocative name, if you want, Alexander Hamilton. List and Hamilton, of course, sort of emphasize the importance of national development, which had to be based to some extent on shielding domestic economies from the pressures of international competition, from better developed, more productive exporters in the rest of the world, to benefit domestic productive diversification, domestic development. And all experiences of success with respect to globalization, not least that of China in the last 4 decades, have rested on establishing the right balance from reaping the gains from trade and specialization versus reaping the gains from protecting domestic economy sufficiently that the processes of productive diversification are not blunted. When economies try to get the gains, reap the gains from specialization, push on that first dimension too much, and forget about the second dimension, they don't do that well. And I think a lot of the disappointments in many countries in Latin America, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in some countries in Asia, from the experience of globalization in the last 4 decades have arisen in part from overemphasizing the gains from trade and underemphasizing the gains from productive diversification. But moving beyond economics, there's a second tension that hyperglobalization accentuates, and that's a question about sort of distributive justice. We know from the basic theory of gains from trade and comparative advantage that redistribution is the other side of the coin, is the flip side of the coin from the gains from trade. You cannot have the gains from trade without having significant redistribution. We're seeing this in the United States, in the advanced countries. We're also seeing it in the middle income countries, and that we have both gainers and losers within countries. And again, I think one of the tensions that hyperglobalization has accentuated in the last few decades is that we've emphasized the importance of the gainers, and we've basically poo-pooed the losers by saying that social protection, social insurance would take care of them. I would say that in Latin America, we've had put in place much better systems of social protection and poverty reduction that protected the poorest in the distribution, often people who were not directly affected by international trade. But existing systems have not done very well to protect the lower middle classes or the middle classes. Think about the production workers in manufacturing that incur the cost of deindustrialization, many jobs of medium productivity disappearing as these countries opened up to trade and had to compete with China and other Asian exporters. So the problems of distributive justice become deeper as hyperglobalization advances, because the logic is that the redistribution begins to loom much larger than the gains from trade, and it becomes even impossible to necessarily compensate the losers with sort of the given the deadweight losses of redistributive taxation and transfers and so forth. So that's tension number 2. Tension number 3 is more broadly with respect to politics and accountability, that increasingly after the 1990s, trade agreement and hyperglobalization became about regulatory harmonization as domestic policies, whether it was on investment policies, subsidies, industrial policies, health and sanitary systems, intellectual property rights, came to be seen more and more as part of the trade system, more and more as trade barriers to the extent that they differed from major trading partners. And I think we've lost balance between, another balance that we need to maintain, between the regulatory harmonization that was needed to reap the gains from trade or to reap more gains from trade versus the gains from regulatory diversity, the notion that existing regulations, business regulations, taxes, social and labor standards, and intellectual property and industrial policy regulations also have to be responsive to the domestic stakeholders. And I think that balance veered too much in the direction of trying to harmonize domestic regulations and treating them as essentially as barriers to trade. I would say that these 3 have been sort of the deep tensions, economic, distributive, and political tensions that hyperglobalization has exacerbated. And in a way, this should not have been a surprise, because we can go all the way back to the first era of globalization, And we had a very similar kind of a backlash against advanced globalization at the height of the gold standard. It was a very different type of globalization. But of course, the very first populist movement in the United States in the late 19th century was in fact in opposition to the globalization of the time, in particular, the gold standard, the idea that the gold standard imposed on countries tight credit conditions, and tight credit conditions meant high real interest rates, which impoverished farmers in the southern and western parts of the United Nations, which then became the social basis of a populist movement, with the famous populist William Jennings Bryan back in 1896 uttering this this very famous piece saying, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." What he meant was, you shall not make our people suffer just so that you can maintain the gold standard and the implied tight credit conditions. But what it spoke to is this deeper tension between the requirements of living by the rules of globalization, at the time the gold standard, and the need to respond to what domestic stakeholders, in that case farmers, today blue-collar workers, manufacturing workers, declining communities needed. Now, I'm making a reference to that earlier era, a different type of globalization, the gold standard, for another reason as well, because it reminds us that, in fact, there are very different models of globalization that one could imagine. We've had at least three different types of globalization. Gold standard was one. Then we had a period which we might call the Bretton Woods period between, let's say, 1945 and the 1970s or 1980s. And then since then, we had what I've called the post-1990 period of hyperglobalization. And they were different, and there are at least sort of 5 different respects identified with these specific columns here in which they were different. Now, what's interesting with respect to the gold standard and today's hyperglobalization was that they shared one feature, and that feature was that the rules by which countries had to manage their economies, those rules reached behind the borders. Under the gold standard, the rules imposed significant constraints on domestic monetary, credit, and debt policies, and that, of course, is why we had the populist reaction back in the 1880s and 1890s in the United States. Today, it's a much broader kind of overreach behind the border. Globalization rules limits what you can do with respect to your industrial policies. They limit what you can do with respect to your corporate taxation. They limit your fiscal policies, your monetary policies. They limit your subsidies, intellectual property rights, and so forth. It's the same kind of reaching behind the borders that I think is a peculiar problem of today's hyperglobalization that was shared with the gold standard as well. Now, the Bretton Woods regime, by contrast, was a regime of globalization that lacked the same ambition, and you can see that if you go along the column, the row, the Bretton Woods, you can see that the number of check marks is fewer. It really aspired only to free trade in goods and not even in agriculture. So it was really free trade in manufacturing. Didn't aspire to capital mobility, and most importantly, didn't aspire to have rules that reached behind the border. So the trade agreements under the Bretton Woods regime were limited to tariffs and non-tariff barriers at the border. Countries were free to have capital controls and manage their monetary and fiscal policies autonomously. Of course, they were free with respect to their productivist policies, their industrial policies, and so forth. The paradox is that even though Bretton Woods was a very unambitious model of globalization, it was actually very good for the expansion of trade and long-term investment. So if we compare the 4 decades between 1950 and 1990 to the post-Bretton Woods the hyper-globalization period since 1990, the paradox is that in fact world trade expanded much more rapidly under the Bretton Woods regime. And I note here that I've left the first 5 years after the Second World War aside, because that was arguably would have been a quick recovery rebound in world trade from the Second World War. But even if we don't take those first 5 years after 1945 into account, we have very rapid rise under world trade. I think the paradox is resolved by understanding that the environment that provides the most suitable environment for world trade and long-term investment to thrive is an environment where, in fact, the constituent units of the world economy, that is the nation states, individual countries, are given the room, the autonomy to do what's required to maintain social contracts, and to pursue growth-oriented policies. So I think that was the success of the world, the Bretton Woods period, and that it created confidence in the world economy precisely because domestic policies were so much geared towards maintaining social stability at home and economic health at home. A kind of balance that was reversed after 1990, when increasingly domestic policy became hostage to the global economy. So I think when we look forward, and I'm sort of now coming to sort of the prescriptive part with respect to globalization, the future of globalization. So I think there is a kind of a good scenario for the future, which is that essentially a new set of traffic rules that reinvigorate or return us to the spirit, not the specific rules, but the spirit of Bretton Woods, which a kind of a more permissive a global economy that enables developed countries to reconstitute their social contracts at home, and allows them to impose protection when it's required through border policies that prevent regulatory arbitrage. That might mean regulating inward foreign investment when that threatens to undermine domestic national security or innovation systems, or it might mean a carbon border adjustment, carbon border taxes to protect domestic climate change policies and so forth. And I think for developing nations, similarly, a kind of prioritizing the need to reconsider development strategies, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. And I think that doesn't mean that we pay less attention to global rules and global governance. It means that we refocus global governance to those areas where there are genuine global public goods that need to be delivered. And that's primarily climate change and global public health, and those areas where international coordination can really pay off, as in the case of tax havens and coordinating corporate taxation. Now, China, I think, is going to be a major issue going forward. I think currently discussion about China in the context of the global economy revolves around these two polar narratives. One is trying to return to the status quo ante of deep integration, bringing China into the rules of WTO, although that I think very few people now have much confidence that that is feasible anymore. And it's another position which is much more about really decoupling, a significant disentanglement of economies of the West with China. I think here the Bretton Woods-like alternative would be what I've called here peaceful economic coexistence, going back to a model of much more shallow integration, providing China with much greater room to maintain its own economic model, its own industrial and intellectual property rights policies, state enterprises, and so forth, while enabling Europe and the United States and other nations the room to uphold their own social standards, labor market standards, and their innovation systems. I think I would maintain that you can reap significant gains from trade in a regime like that, while leaving countries also a fair amount of policy autonomy to do what they need to do domestically. Of course, that's not the only possible scenario. If that's sort of the good scenario as I see it, there is the bad scenario, which would be a kind of a 1930s style descent into trade wars and increased autarky. I don't think that's very likely, but there's an ugly scenario, which is where trade tensions continue to prevail. There's periodic trade wars, conflict with China escalates, and so forth. And unfortunately, I cannot rule out the ugly scenario. And essentially, that's what we've been living under Trump during the last 4 years. But I wanted to argue that there is a kind of an alternative, a good scenario going forward, which is not exactly a repeat of what we had before, and tries to replicate the spirit of a different model of globalization. Now, let me say a little bit about what's happening domestically and what I think the kinds of things that we will need to do domestically to engineer new growth models. We're coming off a period when, in fact, developing countries, including many middle-income countries like Argentina, were doing relatively okay. But not only did COVID put an end to this, I think, once again, that pre-existing model was not sustainable. And let me explain why the kind of growth that we had in the last decade or so was not sustainable. There's a kind of a traditional growth model that drives structural change in countries where essentially we have a transition out of agriculture into manufacturing and into services, transition from informality to formal organized activities. So this is the traditional model of structural change. What we're having today in the low and middle income countries is something that looks very different. We're essentially largely bypassing manufacturing. Even countries that had a kind of an industrialization experience are experiencing premature deindustrialization. Essentially, it's not that people aren't coming out of agriculture, but they're moving into services, but they're moving into relatively low productivity, informal, petty services. And there's very little movement into formal modern activities, including manufacturing. So where did we get this kind of growth? Recently, it did not come from this traditional industrialization model. It was not manufacturing led. I think in low income countries, this was a model of structural change that was driven much more by services, but because services don't experience the kind of productivity escalator that industrial sectors traditionally have. In countries like India or many low-income African countries, what we had was that the expansion of modern sectors was accompanied by stagnant or declining productivity in those sectors. Whereas in the middle-income countries, we've had that the successful global integrated modern sectors essentially remained enclaves. They did not absorb labor from the rest of the economy. And the growth that we experienced was largely demand-led through terms of trade improvements, from resource transfers from abroad, in many cases public investment, and sometimes, in the case of India, for example, a kind of an animal spirits led reinvigoration in private investment based on expectation of future productivity improvements that were actually unlikely to be realized. So I don't have much time to talk about the India, because it's an interesting example. But let me move directly to Latin America, and I think where the problems of this more demand-led expansion in Latin America shows itself is a kind of a very dismal productivity performance. Total factor productivity performance at the aggregate level has been very bad in all the leading Latin American countries. And the way that I think about the underlying cause of this is because of the significant level of productive dualism, which I think Mexico exemplifies particularly well, but it's not a problem that's specific to Mexico. And that productive dualism arises from the fact that The insertion of countries like Mexico into the world economy has significantly benefited productivity performance in relatively narrow segments of modern industry, where productivity has increased significantly, whether it's tradable services or manufacturing sectors. In Mexico, these would be many firms in the north that are integrated into the North American supply chains. But they have not expanded in terms of employment. In fact, in terms of employment, they have become narrower and narrower, smaller and smaller parts of the economy as a whole. And as the chart on the right-hand side shows, the productivity gap between the best performing firms and the lagging firms have in fact risen and risen. So this dualism has become exacerbated. Employment, that's very little employment has been generated in the most advanced parts of the economies. So this is a problem that's known as two Mexicos in Mexico, but it's a problem that pervades literally all low and middle income countries today. So that's the essential problem. Advanced sectors are not absorbing labor. In manufacturing, we're experiencing premature deindustrialization. Global value chains, even when they're not successful, essentially have become enclaves. If you're successful in tradable services, they tend to be highly skill intensive, such as finance, IT. They're not going to absorb the kind of workers the economy has. Many countries like Argentina and Brazil that have been very successful in non-traditional modern agriculture, these are capital intensive activities that are actually releasing labor. So again, it's not absorbing labor. And of course, COVID-19 simply deepens this divide between the people, the skilled professionals who can do remote work, and the very poor service jobs where incomes are low, with the sort of the disappearing middle becoming more and more evident. So the question is, and the big question I think that our development strategy faces, and this is not a question that ought to preoccupy policymakers in middle, low, and high income countries, because they're all facing it. The question is, where will the good middle class jobs going to come from? And I view the populist response very much as a symptom of this middle class squeeze and the disappearance or the scarcity of good jobs in all of our societies due to these trends, partly from technological change, partly from globalization, partly from changes in labor market institutions that we've put in place. Now, I think our traditional welfare state model is unable to address the problem as I've now defined it, which is the scarcity of good middle class jobs. Because the traditional welfare state model presumes that the middle class jobs are there, and all you need is to provide people with adequate skills and education, and then focus on sort of social insurance to ensure that people are covered against idiosyncratic risks, such as unemployment, illness, disability, and so forth. So the traditional welfare state arrangements focus on the one hand on providing people with the endowments, particular skills and education, on the other hand of social protection after the fact. The problem today is much more of a structural nature, that we have an inadequacy of good middle class jobs driven by technology and globalization, and you can train people, but if the supply of good jobs isn't there, these people are not going to find the jobs. And simply by transferring income to people, you will be necessarily not dealing with the root of the problem. So I think we need a different post-welfare state kind of approach to combining social and growth policies in our economies. And I'm just going to sort of highlight three key elements of this, and then I'll stop because I've already talked too long. One, as I've said, is that we need to move away from the traditional conceptions of welfare state policies, and we need to engage much more with production stage of the economies. That means that instead of focusing on improving educational endowments and providing social protection and transfers through tax systems. We need to focus much more directly on increasing the supply of middle-class good jobs. And that will mean engaging much more the business sector, the employees directly. And regulation has to move from sort of the economist traditional approach of sort of top-down or principal agent kind of way of regulating business conduct to being much more engaged and hands-on, kind of a collaborative model of interaction to get business to internalize what I've called in other work the good jobs externalities. That society benefits hugely from the supply of good jobs, and businesses, the private sector, does not normally internalize those social benefits. I think finally, we also need to take another look at the direction of technological change. Almost every account about how we should adjust to technology, how should we deal with future technological change, puts the problem in the following terms: that we need to ensure that our workers have the skills and the knowledge that they can adapt to new technologies. But that's, when you think about it, is a very, very odd way of thinking about this, that we are saying basically the society has to adjust to technology, and that we don't talk nearly enough about technology adjusting itself to society. So I think technology must adapt to workers' skills as much as the other way around. That requires us to think about differently about technological innovation process, how we can reorient it, how we engage with innovation systems, what kind of technological systems we should promote. That's a very big and largely untested area, but I think we'll need to think much more about this. So just to tie it all together and close, I think our central problem that we're looking at is this deepening economic dualism within nations that's created a stark divide between technologically advanced and globally integrated parts of our economy and a very large group of lagging firms, sectors, and regions. And that's essentially has produced the backlash against hyperglobalism. It's produced significant inequality, shrinking of middle classes, economic insecurity, and also has slowed down the growth engine, because not having enough good jobs in the middle also means that the benefit of technological change and productivity are not trickling down to the rest of society. And that's why I think the social problem, the inclusion problem, and the growth problem have largely merged. So that's a lot. So let me just stop here, and we have at least a little bit of time left for some discussion. So let me see if I can stop sharing my screen. Eduardo, over to you.
Yes, well, you gave us a lot to chew. I will be selective. We received 50 questions. We don't have time for those. I have my small list here. I want to start by linking to the last concept that you tried to develop there, that we don't have enough jobs, good jobs, which is, I think, central, particularly for Latin America, but I think in the whole developing world. I have two questions there. One that is more policy driven. How do you see, you're proposing directing or orienting technology and also economic activity towards creating those jobs, as opposed to retraining, reskilling actual workers. I wouldn't say education. Education is very broad. I would probably focus on reskilling specifically to match the demand. So you want to move the demand rather than the supply, or maybe both. How would you do that? And to what extent there is a trade-off involved there? I mean, the activity which is presumably driving the way in which technology is advancing, and these good job externalities, which are valuable, but not necessarily hand in hand with productivity.
Yeah, so I think in many domains, that may not be a kind of a very tight trade-off. That is that when businesses face and innovators face a whole range of choices about what kind of technologies to adopt. There's a story that I like citing when Elon Musk was creating, it was just recently tried to completely automate the production of Model 3 of Tesla, and this was going to be really virtually no humans in the factory, and the whole factory would essentially operate at greater than human speed. So you couldn't have any humans, interacting with the machines, because and it soon turned out that he had made a total mistake, that this was never going to work, and he created another assembly line on the parking lot with lots of people working to bring up the production numbers of Model 3. And when he was confronted with it, he said, look, I screwed up. I think the potential of human workers, he said, is completely underestimated. So here is a case where he made a huge amount of investment in robots and automation, and it turned out that the productivity benefits were negative, and he had to go back to a much more sort of human-based assembly line. So there is an ethos among sort of the sort of in Silicon Valley and investors that that doesn't necessarily align even in the end with much greater productivity. That if the decision makers aren't taking into account not just the number of jobs, but the kind of autonomy that individuals are going to have on the job, you're going to get a very different type of technological output that might increase return to owners of capital. So Daron Acemoglu and Pasquale Restrepo have this notion of social technologies. So they make the argument that often, in order to replace the innovators, will invest in technologies that replace labor, but produce only so-so productivity gains. And because that's a kind of productivity change that increases the return to capital and the owners of the machines, but produces actually very little overall TFP. And in fact, we know that the overall TFP growth that's come out of this, this wave of innovation in the last 2 decades has been very, very dismal. So we don't see the productivity benefits. So I think there's a lot of reasons to be skeptical that the kinds of values and the kinds of objectives that the innovators have internalized as the direction in which they're taking technological change is good for productivity, let alone sort of the good jobs externalities. So I think so there is so I don't think that this trade-off is as tight as you made it sound. So there are lots of different margins that even that we can intervene. And by the way, I would say that one of the major ways, and this is very important for countries like Argentina, when we think about in countries like Argentina, when you think about innovation and productivity, we are almost instinctively thinking of how can we get frontier technology into sort of the best performing firms. That's what innovation and R&D is about. But the much better way much more effective way of increasing productivity in a country like Argentina, in most middle income countries, is actually would be to get more workers into the middle productivity sectors there. Because then you're expanding sort of the middle productivity. If you get people from out of informality, out of part-time employment into sort of medium productivity jobs, you have actually much bigger boost on the overall productivity of the economy than with the traditional kind of innovation and R&D policies. So that's an important sort of switch in our mindset as to how we should think about innovation and productivity, that much of our obsession about innovation at the frontier does not produce the economy-wide TFP benefits that we would like to see.
Linking what you just said with this idea that I've heard you, many times talking about, that the export-driven development or industrialization model has, so to speak, run its way, And now we have to look at different models if we want to think of the development of middle-income countries or even low-income countries in the future. And you typically point to the African case, or I've seen at least what I read from you. How would that African model, if that's sort of a pre-model that you have in mind, how would that apply or would be customized to high middle-income countries like the Latin American ones, the main Latin American countries? How you think this works in practice?
I think that, when you ask where are the jobs going to come from and where we might create good jobs, they're going to be largely in non-tradable services. They're going to be in health, they're going to be in education, they're going to be in retail. And what we need to think about is first, what are sort of in general the rules for labor market rules, so that we can ensure that people have modicum of security, modicum of autonomy, that these platforms and the gig economy does not exacerbate the dualization of labor markets. So part of it is really about the rules, setting the right rules. Part of it is to ensure that we're working not just with the skilling, reskilling, or the training of people, so that they can join sectors like becoming nurses' aides and physicians' assistants and teachers' aides in expanding sectors where in fact employment is going to be generated, but that we're investing in the kinds of technologies that rather than replacing medium-skilled individuals, augment the skills of middle-skilled individuals. So for example, in the health sector, that's going to mean, investing in AI systems that augment what nurses or physicians' aides can do, expanding the range of the kinds of tasks they can perform into tasks that traditionally maybe physicians have performed. In education, it might mean giving relatively less skilled teachers the kind of AI tools that they might be able to follow what the learning process of individual students, the learning styles of different students, and essentially provide much more individualized learning to different groups of students according to their needs, using these AI tools that can provide real-time feedback on what's really happening in the. So that's another way of increasing the demand for these kinds for these workers, is to multiply the number of tasks. Customization, which new technologies allow, is one way of increasing the number of tasks that can be performed. So one dimension is using technology to increase the range of tasks that can be performed through customization, for example. Another is to deploy technology to augment the skills of the existing labor force so that they can provide more sophisticated functions. So when we start thinking about that, it means not just increasing the skills and the training of the workforce, not just working on education and training, but also engaging with the firms and providers of jobs and the employers, so that they're making the right investment choices. They're investing in the right kinds of technologies, the right kind of organizations within their jobs. So that's the part that I was talking about. It's the industrial policy part of my approach, which is working collaboratively with these firms to ensure that they're making technology and employment decisions that are much more in line with these good jobs externalities. But it'll have to come from these, I think, sort of these, huge range of labor absorbing skills, labor absorbing non-tradable services.
And you think the policy involves, how do you implement the incentives that are underlying these changes? If there are externalities, in which way the state, the government, the rules could have moved this forward?
Yeah. So just yesterday, I was talking with some other Argentinians, and I asked them the question about how is it that Intel has been, so successful in a country that is known to have experienced one failure after another where industrial policy is concerned. Yet you have one agency, the Agricultural Technology Agency, that has proved actually relatively successful engaging with groups of producers in different parts of the country, implementing precision agriculture or getting genetically modified rice varieties adopted. And it's a kind of a very similar kind of collaborative model where you have a combination of groups of firms, groups of agricultural producers teaming up with essentially a state technological agency to develop new technologies, to disseminate and to provide extension services to a bunch of producers. And so, INTA works very well in a lot of parts of the country. INTI, which is, the counterpart for manufacturing, apparently doesn't work very well. So, that was my question. I was trying to understand why. But the point is that even in a country like Argentina, where, when people hear the term industrial policy, they start to get hives. There is experience of, sort of good examples where, agriculture has been a success and some public-private collaboration has been important in that. So even in Argentina, we have examples that it might work. And I think the question is to get the institutional setting right. My understanding is that one reason why INTA may have worked well is because it's fairly decentralized. So there's been a lot of experimentation with different parts of the country. And INTA has worked well, where it's hooked up with, stakeholders and private producers that have lots, have social capital and are collaborative and want to do the right thing. And it doesn't work necessarily well in other parts, whereas INTA is much more, special, much more concentrated. It's been, I've been told, captured by certain groups. So getting the institutional setting in these things is very important. I think one general principle is you want to allow experimentation. You want to allow different models to coexist, so that and to learn from those that are working relatively well. And I think, INTA is an example that this can happen. We just need to take that model and apply it to the non-traded parts of the economy, where and with a jobs focus. You see, even INTA doesn't care about jobs. They care about technology. They care about exports. But it's not creating jobs. And I think we need to take that kind of approach and apply it with a much more jobs focus.
Let me, because we're running out of time, we have like another 15 questions. Let me conflate three into one. I mean, there are some people that are asking about how the Chinese model, growth model, will evolve from now on, particularly in the post-pandemic period. We export a lot to China, so there's also a question about what markets should be searching, should be trying to open now that the world is changing in the way you described before. And given that China probably will change also its trade pattern. And the third one is about the global climate change debate. We export essentially transgenics, meat, and non-renewable natural resources. So to what extent this agenda, which is hopefully going back to steam, will hit us exactly where it hurts? And this in the context of Latin America, in particular Argentina, which are countries that export very little relative to their growth aspirations. Yeah. So it's like, there's three questions to win.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are all additional reasons why, particularly for Argentina, I mean, I think the future that looks to the world economy, it looks to China and commodity prices, doesn't look very bright. I mean, I think those are all reasons why, we should be asking different kinds of questions. We should be asking, where are the, how are we going to prop up the middle of the skill distribution? How are we going to create good jobs in the non-traded sectors? Remember, the question you just asked me had nothing to do with those, middle sectors of the economy, about those non-traded service sectors. And that's what I'm trying to militate against. I'm just saying, these are the questions that we ought to be really worrying about right now, because that's really, going to determine the success. All the more reason for why, all the more reason given that, some of the bright spots that promoted growth for certain sectors in Argentina in the past are not going to be nearly as bright going forward. So I think we do need that kind of reorientation. I have to say, this is not about protecting the economy, right? I'm not talking about, because I don't think manufacturing jobs are going to come back. So I'm not arguing. Now, if there are some manufacturing sectors which have good plans, good plans to reorganize and they can make credible commitments to increasing employment, and if the price to get those things going is a little bit of protection, I would say, why the hell not? Let's do it. But protection, not for its own sake, protection as a vehicle through which we can help certain industries modernize in a way that's actually also creating jobs, as long as they're creating jobs. But I don't think that's going to add up. That's not going to be the future in terms of jobs. I think the future is going to come from a very different part of the economy. And those are not the parts of the economy we've usually thought of as being the growth leaders. And I think we need a kind of change.
We will need to be closing now, but this is before the 2 or 3 theses that we're going to ask you. So we still have some more time. So I'll throw 2 questions, completely different. You just take it in the order you want. The first one, which actually again conflates several questions, has to do with your comparison between the Bretton Woods and the current post-90s situation. There is a missing factor there. You mentioned, I remember reading stuff that you wrote many years ago about this, that is the financial integration or financial globalization, which was null during the Bretton Woods period. That was a driving factor of business cycles and crises and the rest during the recent period. So my question regarding that is, do you still think that we have been in the regulatory balance between trade and finance? Do you still think that we have gone overboard with trade and too light on finance, and we need to rebalance that? I remember having read something that you wrote about this years ago. Given the current context, you still think that you have to sort of rebalance these two regulation, less regulation on trade, more regulation on finance?
Well, definitely more regulation.
Provide more autonomy to the countries. That's the point, right? You
mentioned. I think financial globalization has really been a failure. It has not produced the higher investment. It has not produced the higher growth. It has not produced greater diversification and more insurance. It has not produced more consumption smoothing. It has produced more and more painful crises. It has made countries less disciplined, and I think this Argentina is a good example of where it has made actually the supply of funds to the budget more elastic, and therefore in good times it has allowed governments to overborrow by relying on international markets. So in financial globalization, really, in terms of things that matter, most everything has gone wrong. It's very hard to find good things that financial globalization has produced. Now, how we put that genie back in the bottle, I just don't know. But I think much greater financial regulation is part of the answer.
The other question, and probably the final one, unless I don't know how much we can borrow from your time, but has to do with something that is very fashionable in the developed world. And it's coming in a revised version in our world, in developing world, which is essentially how to finance in the future the increase in state intervention and support that we've seen, lately, but particularly during the pandemic. And whether it's going to be through a global pro-increase in taxes, global taxation movement, or we'll need to find something else, another source of finance, or we'll need to actually unwind that state intervention that we put into place in those years. How do you see this progressing?
I see a future where the public sector and the state agencies have to play a much more important role, as I think I've made clear. But I think that maps directly into more expenditure. I think the most expensive part of the government machinery are the transfers, or the redistributive part. And I've argued that, in fact, we have to put a lot more emphasis on supporting lower and middle classes through the creation of good jobs, rather than supporting them through transfers. So in effect, I'm just arguing for something that's going to alleviate the burden on fiscal systems if we do our jobs with engaging the private sector in the supply of good jobs much better. And that's a very different kind of activity. It's not subsidies. It's not necessarily, INTA, which I mentioned before. I mean, it doesn't cost much, but it can be very effective because it's of the type of activity that it engages in. Now, it might be that at some point you need resources, but that's, but the scale of resources that are needed is nothing like, the kind of the transfers that, the European welfare states engage in. And so I don't think that's the future for countries like Argentina. So to my mind, the burden that's going to be placed on fiscal balances, is not a constraint on the kind of direction that I'm pushing for.
Well, we could keep going forever, but I mean, I cannot thank you enough for your time and your words, Dani. It's been, luxury for us, a great beginning for this new series. I hope to have you with us, in the future. But I just want to thank you and thank everybody that stayed with us in this first webinar. And I don't know, Juanjo, if you want to say final word. Otherwise,
thank you, Eduardo. It was good to see you, and thanks to everybody listening.
You take care, and see you around. Bye.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.